Welcome to our Think Aloud on science literacy. So the first thing I do before I start reading is kind of take a look at the article. Where is it from? What kind of article is it that I'm reading? What kind of text is this? In this case, it's from a magazine called Science. And I've got this big picture on the front of a big fire. And the title of the article is Tiny Beetles Don't Cause Big Fires, Study Finds. Raising Policy Questions. Interesting. We've been talking about forest fires in class. I wonder if this article has to do with forest fires. It kind of looks like it based on this big picture. But I'm going to scroll down and kind of take a look around, see what else the article has, if there's any sections or obvious organization. The first thing I notice here is a couple of links. In this case, I'm going to decide to click on them later. I'm going to read the article first. Doesn't look like there's any other sections or titles, so I'm just going to start reading. Vast armies of tiny tree-killing insects called bark beetles have eaten their way through millions of hectares of pine forest in the western United States since the mid-1990s, leaving the mountains of Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho and other states riddled with dead trees. But contrary to popular belief, say the authors of a new study, the beetles are not to blame for the record-breaking extent of the wildfires that have torched the region's forests in recent years. As you can see, I have underlined some of the words I'm not sure of. The first one is hectares. It sounds like it's some kind of measurement, but I'm not sure what it means. The second one is riddled. Even though I know that word, I'm not exactly sure about the way that they're using it here in this context. I don't think that not knowing these words is taking away from understanding this paragraph, so I'm going to move on without looking it up. The next thing that I usually do is identify key concepts. What do I know already? We're talking about wildfires, and they're talking about beetles, bark beetles, to be more specific. I experienced a lot of wildfires this summer because it was so smoky in Missoula. I think this article is going to tell me why the author doesn't think the bark beetles are affecting forest fires. It kind of says it here in the last paragraph. Another thing to think about for me is that bark beetles is underlined here. When I click on it on the article, it's a link to another article related to the same subject. It looks like it was also written by the same author about a year ago. Might be interesting reading later on. I think I'm ready to move on to the next paragraph. The study, published online on 23rd March in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, is the first to take a large-scale look at how beetles are affecting the acreage burned across the western United States. Its findings are consistent with earlier research looking at smaller regions and are likely to fuel an ongoing debate over the wisdom of relatively expensive federal efforts to cull insect-damaged trees from western forests, in part to reduce fire risk. We examined an assumption that's been made in a lot of policy and management discussions, says co-author Tom Velbin, a forest and fire ecologist at the University of Colorado Boulder, that as a result of tree kill by bark beetles, there should be an increase in the aggregate area burned in the U.S. In this section, the only word I wasn't sure of is cull, and I decided, since I don't really understand what they're talking about, to look it up. Cull, to reduce or control the size of. That makes sense. They're talking about getting rid of insect-damaged trees. Okay. Next, I'm going to look for key ideas. I see that they're talking about an assumption, and I'm wondering what that assumption is. Let me read this again. Oh, I see. The assumption is that trees killed by bark beetles increases the amount of area burned in the western United States. That seems like an important point. And who are they quoting here? Who is Tom Veblen? Oh, they say co-author. Maybe they're referring to the article they're talking about in the paragraph before. To see if that assumption is correct, the researchers compared U.S. Forest Service maps of forests affected by the mountain pine beetle, the beetle species responsible for the most tree death, with maps of acreage burned during the peak wildfire seasons during 2002. We are looking to see if there was more area burned in forests that had been infested by mountain pine beetle rather than the live forest, says lead author Sarah Hart, a University of Colorado postdoctoral researcher. The result, Hart says, we did not find any difference. Specifically, the researchers found that beetles had recently attacked just 5% of more than 100,000 square kilometers of forest that burned during the 2006, 2007, and 2012 wildfire seasons. Here I underlined U.S. Forest Service because I know that my friend's dad works for the U.S. Forest Service. And then I underlined peak wildfire seasons because I was wondering when that was. It did seem like there was more smoke in the air during August and September. Maybe that is peak wildfire season. The other thing I noticed was this definition, the mountain pine beetle, which is the beetle species responsible for the most tree deaths. Good to know. This is the beetle we're mostly talking about here. The next thing that I look at is Sarah Hart, a University of Colorado researcher. She must be another person involved in writing that article that the whole news article is related to. The other part of this that is really interesting is that here I am presented data. This really makes it a scientifically based news article. The author here is showing us some of the data that was presented in the research that supports the idea that beetles don't affect wildfires. I'm going to keep reading before I make up my mind about how I feel on the subject. Some researchers worry that poorly planned thinning efforts could be at best a waste of money, and at worst do more ecological damage to forests than they prevent. Veblen, for instance, says that the evidence suggests that thinning beetle kill at a landscape scale isn't likely to prevent big fires. In part, that's because hot, dry weather plays a much bigger role than beetles in determining when and where forests burn, he and his colleagues have concluded. Under these conditions, which have been common in recent years, both live and dead stands of trees burn spectacularly well. Veblen acknowledges that smaller-scale thinning efforts are necessary to reduce fire risk around homes and critical infrastructure, such as reservoirs, but notes that such strategies are often useful whether or not trees have been killed by beetles. In this paragraph, I underlined thinning because I don't really know what they're talking about in this context. I decided to look it up since it seems important and they used it so many times. Forest thinning, the selective removal of trees to improve the health of other trees. Also in this paragraph, they start to talk about that policy issue that's mentioned even in the title of the article. Here it says a waste of money and is describing thinning as potentially a waste of money because it doesn't prevent fires. There's also something else important here. The author is saying that hot, dry weather plays a bigger role than beetles. I'm going to circle that. In fact, I think I'm going to underline it too. Let's keep reading to see how this argument plays out. Although the study's main finding is sound, says Matt Jolly, a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service Fire Science Laboratory in Missoula, Montana, the research does not address another issue that's frequently overlooked, how insect damage might influence the behavior of wildfires, making them more dangerous and difficult to fight. There are really two ways of looking at how mountain pine beetles affect actual fires. Jolly says, one is to go in after the fact and study how beetles affected forest ecology, or the area burned. As Hart and Veblen did the other side of the story, Jolly said, is to consider how these fires burned when they were burning. Here we get the other side of the story. Interesting, how insect damage affects behavior of wildfires. And this guy, Matt Jolly, he's from Missoula. That's where I live. Wow, this must be an interesting place for people to study fire. Even though I may not have understood every single piece of this article, I think I get the main ideas, including that there are disagreeing ideas about whether or not mountain pine beetle. Well, thanks for reading along, and I hope you get a chance to use some of the strategies and questions that I asked as I read when you read articles in the future.